So I am going to leave my slides with whoever is interested. I have many slides. There is no way I can cover everything. I just want to bring a bit as a provocation, but also as a way of inviting us to revisit established notions, that one of the challenges we face is what I am calling the rise of extractive logics. So we have gone from an epoch, say in the United States and most European countries, till about maybe the 1970s, 1980s, where commerce ruled. And commerce is okay. The traditional bank is about commerce. That's right, it sells something it has, money. So finance, I'm going to focus a bit on high finance. Finance really is a very different type of sector. And one way of putting it, just as a provocation and as an invitation to think, is that finance sells something it does not have. And in doing that, and being very good at it, it develops extraordinarily complex instruments that are truly admirable, algorithmic math. When you walk into Goldman Sachs today, where you used to have 100, the back room, 100 secretaries, today you have 100 physicists. And I'm not blaming the physicists for the negatives that I'm going to describe. But so anyhow, it seems to me that in this very nice project, Peter, that Peter, Karima, and Ed, I guess, have, one of the major challenges has to do with certain very, very powerful sectors. I should also clarify, when I say extractive sectors, I'm not thinking mining, that a bit too, but I'm thinking of high finance. I'm thinking of Google, once it had its platform and Pache the car and all of that. They are extractive sectors. Facebook is probably the best example. They extract, take what is out there, and then they make money. Look how Google made its first billion. They gathered information about all of us for free, and then they sold it for a high price to firms, to enterprises. So that is a bit the framing here. And here are some whatevers. Now, I also say that the way I'm going to talk about it all today is a zone that I like, because I like to discover. And so it's really a zone before method. I want the freedom to discover, to move into zones where if I followed method, I could not move into. And so the zone which I really occupy here is the fuzzy edges of the paradigm, not the center of the paradigm. The center of the paradigm is hard, strong, etc., but the fuzziness at the edges. And one name that one could give to this is analytic tactics. In other words, it's a very partial mode of producing knowledge or interpreting existing conditions. And here are some of these analytic tactics. And the ones that matter to this short presentation is one is the importance of destabilizing stable meanings. When we talk today about the economy, the middle classes, etc., we are really dealing with conditions that are quite different from earlier periods. And I want to factor that in. So the instability or the need to destabilize these very stable meanings. And I should repeat, for a lot, like in a country like the United States, a country like the Netherlands, a lot of it is more or less functioning the same. I'm really focusing on probably what we might call extreme conditions, where new histories are getting made through economics, through cultural instruments, through finance, through modes of building, modes of distributing urban space. So they are, in a way, extreme zones that are my focus. And just that last point, I just as a way to sort of remind us a bit, the making of it all. The making is a partial element. It's much more than just making. But I cannot resist, especially since at least I think some of you are geographers, right? So we make, I love that there. I'm not talking about the makers movement, we made this in 20 years. And I want to recognize a capability, clearly a negative one. I do think, footnote here, that the term capability comes with an incredibly positive charge. We have to free it up from that positive charge. There is a lot of very negative that one could call a capability. I mean, I'm impressed that we managed in 20 years to destroy one of the biggest internal seas in the world. It took us only 20 years. And I should say what I want to pull out of this, it took rather simple instruments. This was not putting a big operation in space. No, quite simple. And so the question then is, can we also do this with simple instruments, make a lot of difference, but on a positive vector? And this is even more impressive. I mean, 1 billion years, and you geographers know much more about this than I do. Now, so one thing that hangs in there, just to bring an activist mode, I have a son who is absolutely brilliant and crazy, and so he hears me talk, and we then are doing, just read it very quickly, we are trying to find a way of developing T code, a kind of DNA, that operates in modes that people can understand, can utilize, and can develop to get at a better world. So ironically, we call it colonizing the scalar niche. In other words, being able to scale up with simple instruments that the average person could use. I'm just going to pass very quickly over that. Now, to understand what's happening today, one question that one can ask is, what is the steam engine of our epoch? The steam engine didn't change everything, but it changed enough to mark a new world, if you want, a new dominant set of conditions. That which can make a new ordering. Again, not change everything, but change just enough. And in a way then determine what is in and what is out. And that's clearly a key issue. Now, I think of, when I give people a chance to say what they think, typically that the new thing, the new steam engine of our epoch is of course digitization. And I argue, yes, 20 years ago. But today, the digital is basically, it's infrastructural, necessary but indeterminate. The question is, how are we using it? Not what is it. It's everywhere. And its shadow effect is huge, so that it includes also people or households or firms that don't have access, poor setups, etc., that do not have access to the digital. So when I think about what is sort of the steam engine of our epoch, and I see this as a major menace, I think of high finance. Now, this, this is a complicated subject if you want, but just to give you a sense, if you think global GDP of all the countries in the world, a bit over 200 trillion. The currencies issued by all the central banks in the world, very dodgy, clearly. But it's like under 400 trillion. What's the value of finance as measured by its standard measure, outstanding derivatives? It's over a quadrillion. That tells me at least one thing. Well, two things. One thing is that you cannot use money simply to measure finance, talking high finance. But secondly, that it's not simply, this is either an extraordinarily creative field, and it is a menace in many ways. If it can have such a rate of growth, and again, I think of it as not being about money. So this is something that we have to confront, et cetera, and I want to develop this just a bit. So here is, for instance, one example. This is one particular instrument, it doesn't matter. This accounts at that point, this is a time of the crises, so you go from 201, less than a trillion, 6 years later, 62 trillion. Think of anything that has that rate of growth. That's an extraordinarily sharp rate of growth. And those 62 trillion were 10% of the global value of finance at that point, 2007, which was like 600 trillion. So, and global GDP was nowhere there, very, very much less. So here is a capability, a roving capability that can engage a whole variety of sectors, that can, act in global spaces, invent global spaces. Now here is something else that is, to me, also in the background of what I'm trying to get at, which are the fact that more and more of financial trading happens in privately owned networks, owned by banks. When Bernanke, our former chief banker, when he came head of the Fed, when he left, he said, he mentioned all the good things, and then he said, but there are two bad things. And one of them was what he called dark pools in finance. These are, again, I repeat, privately owned networks. There are long lists, waiting lists of banks that want to get access. Now, they affect the stock market, which is a public domain, in a way a very good concept, the stock market. But I don't want to get into that. All I'm mentioning here is that we're dealing, when we talk about whatever we're talking in our world today, we are also dealing with actors that have a power, that have a level of complexity in their operations, and that are almost unreachable. Now, here is one of the negatives that I think many people are familiar with. I don't want to get into it, but the fact of how the financial system, in search of asset-backed securities, which is what the high investment circle asked for them, decided to then financialize, create an instrument that it called subprime mortgage. It had nothing to do with a mortgage, and which used modest housing to generate assets and then create asset-backed securities. Out of that came a tragic, outcome, which was 14.5 million households out. And here are some of those figures. This is foreclosures, but we're talking 14.5 million households. So that was one of the things Bernanke, the former head of the Fed, said when he departed. He said, and this is a bad thing that happened here. That instrument is now declared illegal. It has entered Europe, where Germany is #1. It's a brilliant instrument. Nothing to do with housing. It's like you create a field and you put those 14.5 million houses, or whatever they might be, and then you use them as asset-backed securities, because finance intermediates a lot of this kind of stuff. Now, I want to come back to a particular moment, and just as one little example, which is 2000 to 2005. By that time, a lot of Eastern European countries had entered sort of the Western mode. And I want to look, first I want to invite you to look at this title. This is just an element that illustrates, right? Ratio of household credit to personal disposable income. Credit sounds good, right? Well, it's debt. Now, let's take Hungary. 2000, these are countries that were at this point really entering our kind of system. That was 11%. The United States at that point is already over 100%. Right? And you can, Germany, by the way, look at the stability, 70, 70, 70. How they do it, I don't know, but they do. Now Hungary, 11% in 2000, almost 40% in 2005. And that is why this credit language is, it should be named by what it is. Now, when I see this kind of stuff, I then ask, who owns that debt? These are modest households, mostly, clearly. And so I went checking again in the IMF staff papers, which I really like working with. And here is Hungary. So it turns out that 40% of that debt, that household debt, we're not talking firms, is in the hands of foreign banks. It's actually three types of foreign banks. They're all Germanic. German, Austrian, and Swiss. How that happened, I don't know. Now, here is an element that I would describe as extractive. If that household debt is owned by a local bank, and these are fairly simple debt, this is not complicated debt. If it were owned by a local bank, you could make the argument that when those households pay the interest, they're actually helping create a positive effect. You know, something builds up, the bank may be able to hire a new employee, whatever, but sort of a neighborhood, positive neighborhood effect. When it goes to those foreign banks, and even if they were national banks, but international, you know, you have extracted a capacity to consume, very modest, with all the implications it might have for that neighborhood, and taken it to central. This is to some central headquarters. This is something that is happening all over. And so in short, I give you just one little example here, but one way of putting it is that extractive sectors can extract even from modest households. So, you know, the two examples that I gave you there. I want to put that on the table because with all our good intentions, and I loved, Peter, all the things that you said, we are facing actors who have completely different logics from the more common and recognizable logics within which most people and most small, you know, local firms, etc., operate. Now, just as a provocation, one image that I like to use is the question of franchising. So if I need a computer, I do need a franchise. I'm not going to go to the factory to buy it. But do I need a franchise? By the way, franchise means that part of the consumption capacity of the locality leaves. And cities are chock full with franchises. If I'm thinking neighborhood upgrading, neighborhoods that can function, that have lots of, you know, all the positive things, the franchise is one mode in which part of the consumption capacity for whatever the item is going to leave that neighborhood. So my rhetorical question is, do I really need a multinational to have a cup of coffee in my neighborhood? I don't. But I do, because that's about the only coffee shop there is, more or less. You know, it's some franchise or another. So for me, besides what a second key point is, how do we begin to relocalize activities? I think that is a crucial aspect of recovering the city as a space that has these potentials, that has these possibilities, where people can actually be, you know, actors in the making of local economies, rather than simply consumers. And I've done quite a bit of research on this. This is not the moment to, but again, this is one way of beginning to deal with urban questions that depend on the capacities that urban space has to be a productive space, rather than just, you know, a space for housing and for etc. Now, here is yet another mutation of urban land. This is something that we've got to deal with. So I'm trying, on the one hand, to describe the capabilities that urban space contains within it, but on the other, all the threats. So this, yet another mutation of urban land. This has to do with I have a set of data that is the top 100 cities. I'm really looking at the top 50 in the world that are the objects of investment, of, you know. And I should say that, so here are some numbers, let me first go. And again, here's just 10. This is just one particular year, 2013, 2014. This is only buying existing property. This is not developing, this is not site development, this is not making new buildings. This is just existing property. It's annual, you know, and so that is one particular year, mid-2013 to mid-2014, 55 billion, et cetera, you just go down the list. And this is foreign buyers, and I love this here, Amsterdam, well, Amsterdam Randstad. This rate of increase, what are they buying? I think of, Amsterdam is a fairly small, Randstad, and so I find this rate of increase. Now, this is just increase over the prior year. If it's a negative, there is no negative here, it can still be a positive in terms of the actual buying, but compared to, an earlier move. Now, well, let me just stick a bit more with this. So here is something that I want to put on the table. And that is when I was doing my Global City book, we're talking way, way back when, in the 1980s. There was quite a bit of buying at that point, by the Japanese in New York, by all kinds of nationalities. But there was a strong utility function in that buying. This buying winds up with a lot of empty buildings. Buildings that are either underused or barely used. So I do see a difference. These, especially the top cities, have long been objects of desire for all kinds of investors, for strong utility functions, weak utility functions, whatever. The question is, how are they using it when they buy it? And if they are underused, then you know that the utility function is not the self-evident one. They're going to use the building. There is something else happening. And I want to, just before, well, maybe I should just argue now. So it seems to me that one of the issues here is actually that those buildings, those empty buildings, are operating on two levels. One is the building. You buy the building, you rent it out, we also know that it is a way of storing capital, it's a way of cleaning your capital, etc., a whole variety of issues. So these buildings, some of these buildings that we're seeing half empty, are being financialized. They are, yes, the building, you can, yes, rent, buy the flat, etc., but then they're also operating on another circuit. At the limit, worst case scenario, we can wind up with very rich cities or city centers with a lot of great towers that are empty. And that's not good. I don't know if anybody has been in certain parts of Manhattan. Those buildings are not tragic mistakes. They're producing more rent, more income for their owners because they are financialized. They are functioning as an asset to construct asset-backed securities. Now, I don't know if people are still with me here on this, but you understand what I'm talking about, right? So the highest profit you can make is to have those buildings empty, and then they are just they're feeding asset-backed securities, and it can be bought, sold. It can be a door, a floor, whatever, anything. So this extraordinary flexibility that algorithmic math produces. You put in the inputs, we can all make algorithms, right? You put in, and then, wow, you take it in many different directions. And so when we talk about good cities, urban space, etc., it's not just construction, it's not just planning. We are dealing with the fact that the rich part, the good parts, or whatever you call it, of cities, of major cities across the world, frankly, but it's very acute, certainly London and New York are very acute, that empty buildings can make more money than buildings that are inhabited, that are rented out. That is an extreme version. I don't know if people, so we can wind up, as we're beginning to see in Manhattan, in certain parts of Manhattan, with a lot of super under-occupied buildings that are actually delivering a very good amount of money. Now, the other thing that has really engaged me in this project is the fact that the material today tells us less of a tale than I think it used to. Now, this is tricky when you say than it used to, but so here is one very elementary example for those of you who know London. This is central London, the Thames there. These are all very fancy buildings, etc., etc. And so I never go there, frankly. It's chock full of tourists, etc. But I was asked by a journalist to walk with him and so I began to hear the tourists talk, and they would just, and there's a lot of nice British buildings. This is not so nice British, but anyhow, a lot of them are sort of, very nice, valuable. And I heard tourists say, look at all those lovely buildings, British buildings, British buildings. So I decided to take, it took a bit of effort, but to take some of these buildings and find out well, they are all owned by one Chinese company. That's interesting. And what's interesting is that the materiality of the English building tells us only part of the story. And when you think of the urbanist, there's something about the visual, the material, that is sort of a critical factor in how we understand and see a city. Well, in fact, the material is telling us much less, and that holds also, I would argue, for what I said about the subprime mortgage, than it used to. And so we need to expand our categories of analyses. Now, when you look at the value of this stuff, and again, we're talking this bit here, so you see top 100 cities, by property investment, that list that I showed you the beginning of, 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, 70% of property investment. Investment really, it's more, it should really say financialized. These are not my figures. But it's not that 70% of all great properties. No. We're talking a very, very small number, but they are the ones that are financialized. Now, that means an extraordinary concentration of, and here is Savills, according to Savills, and they sort of know their stuff. I was trying to do some research on Phnom Penh and cities like that, and I couldn't get any traction. There were no local scholars researchers. And Savills had data because they, of course, they are in the business of selling properties and renting out. According to Savills, and you see it up there, worldwide real estate assets comprise nearly 60% of the value of all global assets, including equities, bonds, and now note what is included and what is not included. There are no derivatives included there. And that was 217 trillion. So that is more than global GDP. And that's just one fraction of building. In other words, am I speaking too fast? So that means that we're dealing with a capability that can actually produce extraordinary value in dollars, whatever the currency. And it's mobile, it's quite invisible. The material world that it mobilizes and financializes doesn't have speech. It doesn't tell us. So anyhow, these are some of the issues, right? So to me, there is a lot of conceptual and theoretical work that we can do. What are we actually seeing here? Now, some of this stuff are old practices, but they are today functioning in a very, very different context, partly because of this incredible development of financial instruments that really are one of the most amazing. As I said, it's algorithmic math and nothing to do with traditional economics. Now, here are some images that I don't know that you can see, but these are some quite significant figures. So property paid by overseas companies. Now, these are, it doesn't say here the figures. This is many thousand buildings. They are all owned. They're in the London area. They're all owned by foreign shell companies. We have a lot of that in New York City too. I don't know if Boston is already subject to it. Some of these buildings are really underutilized. So this is another element that enters the city. A lot of new construction or old buildings underused. Very different from what happens in the 1980s when that other new era takes off. And here are some examples from New York, from New York City. So this is a famous, mostly empty. 122 of the 192 condos are owned by people who use shell companies that hid their identities. 57% of condos, blah, blah. 69% of condos. Now, this stuff, has been around. This is nothing new in itself. But I say, this is a question also of interpretation. That is why I called it before method. It seems to me that when the curve reaches a certain level, we're on the other side of something. You know, it is really a curve. And I think what we're seeing here is not simply more of the same, more expensive of the same, higher level of investment of the same. I think at some point, and this is a decision that the researcher has to make in a way, right? I mean, there's no hard rule here. But it seems to me that we are on the other side of the curve. This is not more of the familiar. This is something else. And so the question is, you know, is it the importance of cities? Not even, not necessarily. This is, you know, if you have the good, well, fine. But if you can have a whole collection of empty buildings and so make most of your money, that is problematic. Now, what I cannot talk about because there is no time, but I have been very engaged the last few years with looking at land grabs in the global south, not just like that, but also because it means that millions and millions of rural people are getting displaced from that rural land. And one of the final stops where they do find a place, or a place where they can put down their bodies, is of course the large slums, you know, especially in the global south. And so this is an image that to me is very compelling. So there is no place in the world where you can stand and see this juxtaposition, by the way. This is a photo, the lower part, and so an artist put these two together, right? And that is some sort of, I think it's in Malaysia or something like that. I'm not sure. Maybe that was photoshopped. But this juxtaposition, this notion that, okay, they can go to the cities, but they wind up in la periferia, as we say in Latin America, which is not bad. You know, that is a very mixed, it's not like the poorest slums that one might have seen. But this kind of format, you know, incredible density. This is in Latin America. So solid buildings, there are reasonable mini economies, small economies being made in these regions. But to me, and then this collection of high-rise, fancy, expensive buildings, for me this sort of captures in a very extreme version, in other words, on a variable, this is the extreme case, a future that is not necessarily super problematic, but a future that is, you know, it's different from what we experience in Europe and even to some extent in the United States. But in most of the rest of the world, this is quite likely to be the future. And when there is no land, you know, the shanties are being built on water. And again, some of you know much more about this particular, this is in Asia, clearly. So why do all these negatives, at least mostly negative that I talked about, why does it matter? Why does it matter that, you know, admittedly, a small number of cities, but they happen to be major cities, are undergoing these transformations? And it seems to me that one key aspect is that the city has long been a space where those without power are not simply the servant, the slave. They can also be that, but they can also make a local economy, make, you know, a neighborhood, sort of make cultures. And that to me is a critical element that differentiates the city from all kinds of other, that those without power are also there. Secondly, the capacity of the city to make us into urban subjects. Most of the time, we're not urban subjects. We're mother, we're father, we're employee, we're rich, we're poor, we're whatever. But the possibility of constructing an urban subject, whether you're poor or rich, urban. And so one of my images always is the subway, you know, where you can have in many cities at least, total mixes of worlds all there. And so this notion of making a space that can actually construct an urban subject, to me seems extraordinarily important. I could go on and on. I won't do that because I think it's time for me to end. Is it time for me to end, right? Yeah, it is. Okay, he said so. Now I want to to then finish with where I started, which is, I think that one of the major challenges to all these positive elements that a city can also contain, because it can contain all these differences, it can create local economies, it can, et cetera, is precisely these logics of extraction that are dominant today. And I do think that that, and again, I mean much more than just mining, though that might be another one. I think that that is something that in your great project, that you have sort of going, one should confront also that the city, it's not just a nice little space. It's a complex, a very, very complex condition. Thank you very much.